Hello everyone, this is Professor Casey. Welcome back. Today we're discussing Chapter 26 of David Emory Shi's America, A Narrative History, and this particular subject deals with, of course, World War II. Okay, this is the war that has probably gotten the most academic attention in United States history. It's the most well-researched war and largest studied war there is, really, especially in the 20th century and even beyond that. And this is an extremely transformative war, even more so perhaps than World War I, because we end up setting brand new precedents for human rights tragedies, for the number of casualties used in the war, for technological advancements. It really checks all of the boxes as being something that changes the entire outlook of society and the world at large. Okay, so we'll go through each one of the steps as efficiently as we can, because this is a really large topic and something that is pretty difficult to cover in one single presentation. So not everything will get really extensive attention, but we'll do the best we can. So when it comes to the different forms of government that exist in the world at the beginning of World War II, we have several different kinds, and we have the emergence of a brand new kind here. Just to very briefly review, okay, we've already got a capitalist system in the United States. Okay, the U.S. is really the only primarily capitalist country in the world at this point. We have constitutional monarchies in places like Great Britain and France. And we also have, of course, communism, which exists in the USSR. Okay, USSR stands for the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Okay, this is Russia and the surrounding Baltic states. Now, this brand new form of government is one that responds to the fact that these other forms of governments tend to be kind of mixed reviews in terms of how successful they are. Okay, communist governments tend to look at people as the citizen is the property of the state, okay, and the state is responsible for them. They can't always feed them. Poverty tends to ensue. Okay. In capitalist countries, of course, we have a lot of competition. Okay, there's a lot of a wide gap in terms of wages and so forth. We have individuals who are not always able to feed themselves and their families, and so greed tends to be looked down upon in that case. Okay. Constitutional monarchies are kind of along the same lines, because we have an individual who is a figurehead of a government, and the constitutional part of the government kind of tends to be on the capitalist side as well. Okay, so we might have the same type of competition, same type of social class distinctions, greed, and so forth with that as well. So these other forms of government that have been existing so far have not always been highly successful. And so the brand new form of government that we see emerge at the beginning of the 20th century in Europe is something called fascism. Okay, and the term fascism comes from the symbol that you see here on the right-hand side. Okay, something called the fasces. And fasces is a Roman symbol of power that symbolizes the consolidation of power. Okay, and that's really the entire idea of what fascism entails. Okay, you have a dictator who works as the supreme head of the government, and every decision that is made on the government's behalf is made on the part of the dictator. Okay, they are the ones who are in charge of everything. And the dictator tends to use very radical forms of propaganda to get the people on their side. They tend to use brute force in many cases to force people, both in the citizens themselves and people outside of their own government, outside of their own country, to do what they want. And they seize control of all areas of national life. Okay, so this is an extremely powerful form of government, and one that is supposed to project this image of authority, control, and uniformity. Okay, and that's really what the fasces symbol is supposed to be. Okay, as you can see here, it's an axe that has been surrounded by several cordons of wood. Okay, and what this symbolizes here, of course, is the axe is kind of the head of the government itself, and the different cords of wood all represent different principalities or city-states or something along those lines that have all been combined to create this kind of unbreakable symbol of power. And the interesting thing about this, too, is if you look on the what are called mercury dimes, and these are kind of hard to find these days. They're not in circulation anymore, but any dime that you see in the United States printed between the years 1919 and 1945 actually has the fasces on the back of it. Okay, If you look at any particular dime that's printed today, of course, it has the Torch of Liberty on the back instead. Okay, so the U.S. by 1945 was trying its best to distance itself from fascism, and so that's why you don't see it anymore. Okay, on the front of the dime, this Mercury dime, you actually have the figure of Mercury, who is the Roman god of messengers and that sort of thing. And today on the dime, of course, you have Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Okay, so after his death in 1945, you actually end up seeing his head printed instead. Okay, so that all ends up changing. Ironically enough, though, the fasces actually represents the U.S. motto pretty well, and it's hard to see in this image because it's kind of small, but here to the right-hand side is E pluribus unum, out of many, one. And that's really what the fasces ends up representing. Now, as I said before, fascism overtakes all areas of national life. Okay, so the government, and specifically the dictator, has the final say when it comes to every aspect of life in that particular country. Okay, so the economy is directly controlled by the dictator. He is usually the one who has the final say over what is done with commerce, what countries we're trading with, and so forth. The armed forces is usually the right hand of fascism in most cases. Okay, it's usually the most well-funded and the most operational area of the government under a fascist dictatorship. Okay, and usually the armed forces tend to be overbearing in most cases, tends to actually end up oppressing its own people in many cases, in addition to other countries. Legal and education systems are all controlled by the dictatorship as well. So educational systems tend to be directly sponsored by the government itself. They're directly funded. And in some cases, they even have a religious institution that's helping sponsor that as well. And that particular religion, by extension, is also directly enforced by the government. Legal systems, so all the courts, everything is directly under the auspices of the government, okay, and specifically under the auspices of the dictator. Okay, so if the court tries to make a decision the dictator doesn't like, the dictator comes in and overrides it. Okay, and of course the press is another big area. Okay, propaganda is rampant in a dictatorship, and especially free speech is usually outmoded. Okay, usually there's no instance of any kind of First Amendment right within a fascist dictatorship. And the common uniting features, something that it tends to use in many, if not all cases, is number one, a high sense of patriotism. Okay, there's usually a sort of nationalist ideology that goes along with this. So you have some kind of a unifying culture, a unifying ethnicity in some cases, and just a sense of love for one's country. The emotional response, of course, is another big deal. You tend to have people who are very eager to all kind of band together and do whatever the government wants. And there's usually an emotional response against people who don't agree. Okay, so it's kind of a lynch mob mentality in many cases, kind of us versus them. And by extension of that, racism tends to go along with this as well. Okay, so if there is some sense of an ethnic patriotism or a geographical patriotism, usually there's an exclusivity that goes along with it as well. Okay, so the targeting of other races, other belief systems, other forms of government, even as something that is, debauched in some form or manner, is something that is extremely associated with fascism. And of course, as I said before, this emerges as a potentially powerful alternative to capitalism and communism. Okay, in capitalist countries like the United States, of course, the government and the people don't always get along with one another. They don't always agree. There's usually some kind of discourse that's going on, and not everything gets done in an efficient manner. Okay, in fascism, everybody is united in the same mental ideology here. Okay, and so ideally, the government is supposed to work like a well-oiled machine, but it's usually done by coercion more than agreement. Okay, so it's something that projects a powerful image, but there's usually something sinister underlying in those cases. And with communism, it's kind of the same thing, right? The government, kind of does the same type of thing, right? It overrides everything that the people want, suppresses all kinds of systems of free speech and so forth, but the people themselves can tend to rise up and overthrow the government, right? There's sometimes a little bit of a gap in between agreement and revolution. Now, fascism in Europe begins in 1922 with the emergence of Benito Mussolini in Italy. Okay, and Mussolini actually begins as a journalist who becomes radicalized over time. Italy, as we saw in World War I, was not a powerful country. Okay, its economy was suffering. It was a kingdom at the time, and its ruler was relatively I hesitate to say incompetent, but wasn't very effective as a ruler. Okay, the people were suffering quite a bit. The peasantry was starving pretty significantly, and so Mussolini, and by looking at the government, by looking at the fact that this type of constitutional monarchy isn't really working, decides to create this really extreme alternative. Okay, and so he ends up with a large group of supporters, about 40,000 of them, in fact, known as the Black Shirts, who all, again, they're all wearing this kind of uniform together, right? They've all been united under this common idea of projecting a powerful image to the rest of the world. And so they march on Rome and actually seize the government by force and take control of the entire country. And within 3 years, Mussolini has elevated himself to the form of the supreme dictator, right? He calls himself Il Duce, which is Italian for the leader, okay? And you see him here in the background, right? Wearing these kind of riding pants, right? He's wearing the infamous jack boots and this kind of military uniform, even though he really is not really a military individual. Again, he's only been a journalist this entire time, right? So he kind of elevates himself to a higher standard of living by doing this. And as the ultimate leader in the country here, again, he's wielding ultimate power, okay? And the long version of what he calls his government is the anti-socialist totalitarian nationalism system, okay? But he shortens it to fascism based on traditional Roman symbols like you see here. And again, using that traditional cultural symbol is something that, again, tends to go along with a lot of fascist countries, right? They tend to call upon the distant past to kind of revitalize and in some ways legitimize what they're doing in the present. So anyway, the whole idea of a totalitarian regime, as you see here, this word totalitarian, is that totalitarian, the key word within it is total, okay? Any government that wields total control, typically through a dictator, is called a totalitarian regime. And that becomes the primary form of opposition and antagonism that we see in the Second World War, beginning with Mussolini and taking a couple of other forms as we go along the way here. Okay, but Mussolini is really the one who begins fascism in Europe. And totalitarian regimes tend to follow a very cliched pathway. Okay, we've already seen it happen in communist Russia so far. Okay, when Vladimir Lenin took over, he did the exact same thing that Mussolini does here. Okay, he outlaws all other political parties, and he ends up murdering all of his political opponents. Okay, so any other political parties are eliminated. Any other areas of government are suppressed. The free speech and all that is suppressed. So he ends up just completely overruling everything else. Now, as I said before, another instance that occurs typically within fascist forms of government is some sort of state-sponsored religious agreement. Okay, and in 1929, this takes the form of what is called the Lateran Pact. Okay, and through the Lateran Pact, Mussolini enters into an agreement with the Vatican, okay, the Catholic Church, to come to a form of a symbiotic relationship here. Okay, what Mussolini does is he grants the Vatican a separate state in the form of Vatican City, okay, which still exists to this day. And in return, he also gives the Catholic Church a complete monopoly over all education in the country. And also, he names Catholicism as the official religion, state religion of Italy itself. Okay, and in exchange, what the Catholic Church does is it grants full sponsorship and legitimacy to the fascist form of government. Okay, so this is kind of a shadowy shady situation, if you like, with the Catholic Church itself, and something that has actually garnered the Catholic Church a lot of negative press, beginning at this point in time and going forward several decades into the 20th century. Because the Catholic Church is now directly allied with a form of opposition, right? A form of what eventually becomes the Axis powers. And so it ends up kind of looking the other way in some cases when it comes to the Holocaust, when it comes to human rights violations throughout the 20th century, especially during the Second World War. So again, not really a situation where we're trying to take sides. Okay, take from this what you will, but this is just a shady situation. Again, something that doesn't always come out on people's good side. So again, the Catholic Church has a monopoly over education, is the official state religion of Italy, and in return, the Catholic Church turns around and grants full approval and sponsorship and approval and all that kind of stuff to what the Italian government ends up doing here. Now, the form of government people are the most familiar with, and what they typically associate World War II with, is the Nazi Party in Germany. Okay. And the political situation in Germany, just as a quick little review and backdrop here for everything that comes afterward, at the end of the First World War, remember we had the Treaty of Versailles. And the Treaty of Versailles specifically targeted Germany as being the one responsible for the horrors of the First World War, for trying to instigate more and more violence. And Germany, remember, was hit with a pretty stiff bill for the First World War, okay, something to the tune of $33 billion. And Germany was already in an impoverished state at this point, okay? The Kaiser had thrown everything in terms of the national budget, economy, everything you can imagine, threw all of it toward the war itself. And the people ended up starving as a direct result of that. So when the Kaiser ended up resigning at the end of the First World War, Germany is essentially left in an impoverished state. Okay, it has no real effective way of bouncing back anytime soon. Now, by the time we get to the 1920s, okay, Germany has kind of been in this little period of famine. It has tried its best to bounce back in some way, but it hasn't been very successful. And so we have the entrance of the former corporal from the German army in the First World War, who we know as Adolf Hitler. And Hitler comes out as being a much more politically radicalized figure in the 1920s, because he ends up looking at what all has happened during the Treaty of Versailles, what has happened to his country, the failings of the Kaiser and the German empire and all this kind of stuff. And he looks at what could have been done alternatively and what could have caused Germany to become successful over time. And he has an extreme sense of revulsion for the Kaiser himself, for the form of government that existed in the past, and for the government that exists at this point in time, right? Something called the Weimar Republic. Okay, and the Weimar Republic, again, is this imposed form of government that's been put on Germany after the Kaiser has resigned. It's a republic of sorts, right? A constitutional republic, but something that is actually very weak. Okay, the armed forces have been severely restricted. Okay, many instances there are no guns aboard ships. The standing army has been reduced to only a few hundred men. The equipment has been severely reduced and all that sort of thing as well. And so Hitler looks at all this and says, this is a prime situation where someone could seize control of this weakened government and turn it into something potentially powerful. Okay, and remember, this is only a year after Mussolini has taken control of Italy, using fascism as a force of power as well. And so Hitler looks at this and he says, maybe we can do the same thing here in Germany. So he stages what is called the beer hall putsch. Okay, and putsch in this case is another term that means something along the lines of struggle or revolution of some kind, right? Something along those lines. Okay, a conflict of some sort. And so beer halls at this point in time are kind of like pubs in the United States, and that they are kind of the centers for social and political discourse, right? People tend to get together and argue about politics and all that kind of thing, philosophy, in pubs. And so Hitler uses this as a staging area to pull together a short coup and to try to take control of Berlin. And in so doing, he thinks that maybe he can do exactly what Mussolini did, and maybe he can recreate that in Germany, right? He likes the idea of this. Problem, though, is as soon as the Weimar Republic gets wind of this, it sends the police and the army out, and all of the members of the Nazi Party end up scattering, and Hitler is left there standing to get arrested. After he's arrested, he's put in prison for several years, during which he writes the book called Mein Kampf. And Mein Kampf is just a German phrase that simply means my struggle, but what it ends up coming out as is kind of Hitler's manifesto for what he envisions for himself and for Germany as a country. Okay, and of course, Mein Kampf has got all kinds of horrible connotations that go along with it, and for good reason. Okay, but it is something that outlines in very excruciating detail Hitler's entire ideology when it comes to why he believes the way that he does, and is actually pretty instrumental in understanding his mindset here. And looking through Mein Kampf, you can actually see how some of the common rumors of what Germany ends up standing for and so forth, some of it can be actually disproven by some of the stuff that Hitler ends up saying. For one thing, people tend to associate Nazism with a form of an atheist government, perhaps. The fact that, somehow, maybe as human rights violations go, Nazis could not believe in God or anything along those lines, but Hitler specifically says that he believes he is doing the work of Almighty God by doing all these different things. Okay, and even by extension, if you look at the Nazi uniform, on the belt buckle, there is the phrase "Gott mit uns," which just means God on our side. Okay, so Hitler is very much believes that he's got some kind of a divine ordaining to be able to do this kind of thing. Ordination is what I'm looking for. But Mein Kampf, again, it ends up kind of explaining everything that he believes. It ends up explaining why he is doing what he's doing. And you can see the influence from a very specific form of prejudice that actually extends back several centuries. And the Nazi ideology is very complicated in general, but going back into the Middle Ages, people had already had a hatred for Jews because of the association with the crucifixion of Jesus. Okay, the whole underlying argument here is that Jews are responsible for the death of Christ. Okay, and there's a specific passage from the New Testament, from one of the Gospels, where the head of the Jews who are overseeing the crucifixion of Jesus tell Pontius Pilate, the Roman prefect, his death be on our heads or on our hands and on the generations that come after us, something to that effect. And forgive me, I forget which book it comes from and all that kind of thing, but this particular phrase has been taken and blown very much out of proportion. Okay, and people all throughout the Middle Ages looked at the Jews as being the ones who kind of instigated this situation and have tried to basically hold it over their heads in some form or another over time. Now, as we get closer and closer to the Enlightenment era, people start to make more and more arguments, similar to what we saw with slavery in the United States. Right? People were trying to make the argument that Jews are born into this kind of social distinction that separates them from God's grace somehow, right? And that somehow they are a cursed people, cursed to wander the world, and constantly be lost, and all this kind of stuff. There's an entire narrative that's complicated that goes in another tangent on that. But Hitler looks at all this, and in terms of a contemporary document that ends up influencing him, there is a document that originated in Tsarist Russia before the Communist Revolution happened, called the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. And this is a document that unfortunately has still constantly been reinvigorated from time to time, even in the United States. Father Charles Coughlin, during the Great Depression, for instance, attempted to politicize it and publicize it in his own journal, the Social Justice Journal, by showing it to the American people. But what this basically insinuates is that it's this gigantic rumor that comes about that somehow Jews are conspiring to take over the world. Okay, that they have got their fingers in politics all over the world, that they are some kind of a Illuminati type group. Okay, and that they are constantly looking for ways to sabotage world governments and cause murders to happen and, drink the blood of innocents and all these horrible things that are basically just, they're nothing but horrible myths that people have come up with through generations and centuries of prejudice. Okay, and Hitler looks at this and he thinks that this is something that is actually legitimate. Okay, and actually begins to use it as a tool to unite people into a common cause. Okay, so very complicated, but this is what he ends up doing. And what Hitler decides to do, rather than try to organize another coup or another hostile takeover of the government, he decides to play the slow game, and that he is actually going to enter into politics as soon as he gets out of prison and slowly work his way up the ranks in a legitimate manner. And this is probably the most haunting aspect of Hitler's entire manifesto, is that he lays out what he's going to do, and then he actually does it. Right? He says that he is going to do this in a legitimate way, to where people have no choice but to say, we elected him into power, we gave him this authority, and now he is actually going to do what he said. So again, in retrospect, it's very frightening. But he says he's going to seize power by using politics to get all the way to the top and to eventually create a race-based state. Okay? Now, Hitler's whole idea of what he refers to as an Aryan race, okay, is something that is also mythical. Okay, an Aryan race that is a blonde-haired, blue-eyed, pale-skinned race of people does not and never has existed. Okay, it's something that's very important to know. The term Aryan actually refers to an ethnic group of people who originate in what is modern-day Iran. Okay, they're a Semitic group of people with kind of this Persian origin. They're dark-haired, dark-skinned, dark-eyed people that have absolutely nothing to do with Hitler's whole idea of basically a super race of white people. Okay, that just has never existed. But over time, throughout the 1920s, now that we're kind of getting past all the ideology and the actual events, Hitler ends up reinvigorating what is called the National Socialist German Workers' Party. And this is where the term Nazi comes from. Okay, Nationalistisch is the term that just means nationalist. Okay, and the shortened version of Nationalistisch is Nazi. Okay, and over time, once Hitler begins to enter into politics, he starts to enter into eventually the German parliament, we start to see more and more members of the Nazi Party becoming a growing minority in the German parliament, to the point to where ultimately they end up becoming a majority over time. Okay, so this is a slow burn, but something that does actually gain a lot of momentum very quickly. By the time we get to 1933, okay, January of 1933, Hitler is actually risen to the point to where he is granted the title of Chancellor of Germany. And this is kind of the person who is almost like a prime minister type situation. Okay, he still has one person who is the head of the government above him. Okay, this is the president of the Weimar Republic named Paul von Hindenburg. Okay. And once Hitler is made the Chancellor of Germany, he ends up withdrawing Germany from the League of Nations. Okay, and this should be the first red flag to the rest of the world, because, again, the League of Nations, even though the United States hasn't been involved in this, is kind of this global police force that is basically saying, as long as you are a member of the League of Nations has the right to look at what you're doing and to make sure that you are staying above board. Okay, so Hitler is basically putting a blinder on the League of Nations by saying, we're not going to be a part of this, so you have to actually look at your own groups of people, and you can't see what we're doing anymore. Okay, so he's blinding the rest of the world to what he's doing here. And again, it should come across as a red flag, but people give Hitler a lot of ground as we go along here. Now, in 1934, Hindenburg ends up dying. Okay, and as soon as he does, this puts Hitler directly in the line of succession here. And Hitler immediately takes power and becomes the supreme leader of Germany, and immediately turns it into a dictatorship and gets rid of the Weimar Republic overnight. And again, he does this very cliched pattern of movement here, and the exact same thing that any totalitarian regime does. He outlaws all other political parties. He also ends up stripping people of all of their political and civil rights over time. So he gets rid of all elections, he removes all labor unions, bans all strikes, basically says that the people themselves have no right to make any kind of demands of the government here. He also goes so far as to create something called the Gestapo. Okay, and the Gestapo is basically a secret police that comes in and looks for people who are doing the wrong thing. And under the Gestapo, right, if you are targeted by them and you are caught, you disappear. Okay, and your family may never learn what happened to you. You may be tortured to death. You may be just simply executed. And people tend to live in fear of the Gestapo over time in Germany, right? Especially if you are a Jew. Now, Hitler's goals when he becomes what is called the Führer, or the leader, okay, that's basically what the word means. Number one, he is going to go back in time and specifically target the Treaty of Versailles. And he's going to say all of the demands that the European countries and the United States have made of Germany, we're going to do away with all of those demands. We're not going to comply. We're going to instead ramp up our military. We are going to empower our government, and we're going to transform the government into this nationalist fascist regime, right? Something that he eventually refers to, ironically enough, as National Socialism. Okay, and Nazism and socialism have virtually nothing in common, so it's kind of an ironic situation here. He also decides he is going to pick up on what the Kaiser originally had in mind to do in World War I and create a greater German empire, specifically in Europe. Okay, he's going to expand German territory and try to create something that he refers to as a Lebensraum. Okay, and Lebensraum just means a living space. And this is something that people tend to overlook when it comes to what Hitler originally envisioned, because people tend to think that the Holocaust and all of the mass murder that occurs under Hitler's auspices is kind of the end game for everything. But really, he envisioned something that was going to happen afterward that obviously never did happen. And that is, he plans to take control of the entire European continent and end up making it into a large German empire, right? Specifically for this German mythical Aryan group of people to live and exist in, okay? Like some kind of utopia. And along the way, he is going to dominate anybody he considers to be inferior, okay? And he's got a long list of people that he doesn't like, right? Everybody who is a liberal, anybody who is a socialist, ironically enough, even though he refers to his own party as National Socialism, communists, people who he believes are social deviants like homosexuals, anybody who is a member of a different ethnic group like the Roma people, the Gypsies, in other words. African Americans he also doesn't like. So just about anybody who is not a white Protestant individual, and not necessarily even Protestant, but even just a white Christian German person with no Jewish ancestry is basically the only person that is considered safe here. Okay, and there's all kinds of holes in this particular ideology, especially when it comes to the Jewish people, because people have blended so much over time, even at this point, that it's virtually impossible to distinguish one group of people from another. And there are no DNA tests at this point in time. Okay, DNA was not discovered really until the 1950s, so there's not really any way of distinguishing ethnicity or ancestry or anything like that at this point. The Nazis basically are relying on antiquated forms of medicine and pseudoscience to determine all these things. Okay, so there's all kinds of problems from the outset here. And Hitler's whole ideology ends up becoming so top-heavy that ultimately it just ends up being crushed under its own weight. But again, ridding the European continent of Jews is something that he wants kind of at the forefront of everything, because he associates the Jewish people, again, not only with the death of Christ, even though that's really not necessarily part of his ideology, it's really something that is part of a unifying system of belief where he can get other people to come on his side. But in addition to that, of course, the protocols of the Elders of Zion is something that he tries to use. And he also associates the Jews with the Baltic states, with Russia, and with communism. Okay, and remember, in World War I, one of the primary problems that Germany ended up facing, one of the biggest disasters that it had, was the communist revolution, and the fact that Vladimir Lenin was supposed to sabotage the government in Russia, and instead what he does is he overtakes it and turns it into something else and withdraws it completely. So he associates Jews and communists with each other and says that they are the real reason why Germany ended up losing the war. So this is a big, long explanation, I understand, but it's complicated, and there's a lot to unpack here. Now, the Axis powers themselves is the term that is given to the antagonists of the Second World War. Okay, remember, in the First World War, we had the Central Powers, and in World War II, we essentially have a repeat of the same group of people with a couple of additions along the way. Concerning the Japanese are kind of the third group that come into play here within the Axis powers. And the Japanese have already had direct sponsorship of Great Britain during the First World War and even before, right? They've been given a lot of technology, a lot of money. And between 1931 and 1932, the Japanese began to occupy the part of northern China called Manchuria. Okay, and we've already seen the Japanese win a couple of minor wars along the way. The Sino-Japanese War, we've seen them win the Russo-Japanese War. They've dominated China, they dominated Russia, and they're showing just how powerful and aggressive they can be. And they become a much more formidable opponent as time goes on here. And remember, Manchuria is an area where there's a lot of rich mineral deposits. There's a lot of oil that can be found there. And so the Japanese are looking at this as a way to tap into more and more natural resources and further empower themselves. And China itself has already been the subject of a lot of imperial exploits. It's been fragmented by civil war already. And now we have a specific civil war that's come about here between the communists led by Mao Zedong, who you see here on the left-hand side, and the nationalist group led by Chiang Kai-shek. Okay. Now, these two groups have different ideologies in mind here, and this is not necessarily to the extreme like you would see in what's going on in, let's say, Russia versus Germany in terms of their ideologies. If you look at a political spectrum, just to do a quick little sidebar here, on a political spectrum, if you draw just a straight horizontal line, if you go all the way as far as you possibly can to the left side of politics, eventually you will run into a communist system, okay, where essentially the government views the people as the property of the state, and it views itself as responsible for feeding them, housing them, giving them jobs, and so forth. Okay, ideally, that is what is supposed to happen in a communist system. Sounds halfway decent on paper, but again, there typically is a totalitarian dictatorship that happens, and it ends up becoming a burden on the people themselves. They lose a lot of rights in the process. If you go all the way to the right-hand side of politics, all the way as far as you possibly can, eventually you hit fascism. Okay, again, another totalitarian regime, but this time the government is also doing the same type of thing, where, again, it's overpowering the people, and it's making the military and everything extremely strong and oppressing people outside of its government as well as people living under it. Now, nationalism falls, again, somewhere along the way, right? Somewhere toward the middle, getting more into the right-hand side of things. So you already have the communists, and now you have the nationalists as well. Okay, and the nationalists are people who are basically saying, we don't want communism here. Okay, that's about as far as they go. We want to create perhaps a constitutional republic. We don't want fascism necessarily. We don't want communism, though, for sure. Okay, so there's already this embroiled thing that's going on here. And eventually, of course, the communists do end up taking over China under Mao Zedong. In 1934, Japan declares that Manchuria is going to be annexed and is going to be independent of China, and is going to try to expand its territory more and more into East Asia. Okay, so Japan is already turning parts of East Asia into a greater Japanese empire. Okay, and that's what we end up seeing the further along we get into the conflict, and especially when America gets involved. Now, in 1935, once Mussolini has consolidated power, he's been in power for a little over a decade now, he ends up deciding he is going to try to expand Italian territory into a portion of Africa called Ethiopia. Okay? And Ethiopia is just south of Egypt. Okay, it's an area that has been long dominated by a kingdom. It's got a very long and rich history of culture that goes all the way back to ancient Egypt. It's done a lot of trade with areas around it, and culturally speaking, it's extremely wealthy. In terms of its technological advancements, though, it's extremely poor. Okay, this is a country that has it's not really not caught up to the rest of the areas that have been dominated by imperialism just yet. Okay, and so when Mussolini comes in, many of the Ethiopians are still using primitive forms of weapons. Okay, sometimes they're only using spears, bows, and arrows, and occasionally they'll get their hands on the odd rifle or two. But Mussolini comes in using tanks, using machine guns, using planes, and very quickly takes over Ethiopia as an area that is potentially rich in gold, in diamonds, and so forth. A lot of mines existing around the area. And immediately the League of Nations, with which Italy is still a part of at this point, by the way, League of Nations looks at what Italy is doing and starts to place more and more sanctions on it. Says that we're going to limit your economy, we're going to try to limit your armed forces because this is a human rights violation. You've taken over a country that couldn't defend itself. While all this is going on, remember Hitler already has put the blinders on the League of Nations. Okay, he's withdrawn Germany already, and has now that he's got Italy kind of distracting everyone else, he ends up revamping Germany's military. Okay, he puts all of Germany's budget toward building up the military, toward building ships, building up armies, armaments, industrializing the country all over again. And by 1936, Hitler has built up enough people in Germany to send 35,000 German soldiers into the demilitarized zone called the Rhineland. Okay, and the Rhineland is kind of this little dark tan area, almost olive green color that you see here in the south portion of Germany and in the western portion here. Okay, and these are areas that again have been demilitarized. These are areas that were pretty heavily affected by the First World War. Okay, they're still pockmarked with bombs, with mines, all these kinds of things, all these areas where the trenches have been dug and so forth. And so he's going to go in and try to take over this entire area. Okay, and again, it's largely unpopulated. Okay, there are still a few peasants perhaps who live there, but at this point in time, there's really not a whole lot of economic advantage for any other country to take control of it. And at the same time, too, way over here in Spain, which has kind of been cropped off at the bottom left part of the map here, you have Generalissimo Francisco Franco, okay, who is a supreme general in Spain who has done the same type of thing that Hitler and Mussolini have done, and that he has gotten direct support of the Catholic Church to revolt against the Republican government and install a fascist state. Okay, again, fascism seems like it's appealing to a lot of these countries because it's granting them a lot of at least semblance of power, if nothing else. And both Hitler and Mussolini look at Franco as a kindred spirit, okay? And they decide they're going to send military and financial aid to Spain in order to support Franco, to install this fascist state, and to try to now have kind of this tripartite group of powers here that could all potentially work together. Okay, again, Italy, Spain, and Germany all potentially working together to expand their territory. By 1937, the next year, the Japanese government ends up being overtaken by militarists. Okay, and the militarists are people who are really out for Japan to turn into a larger empire in East Asia. And so they end up taking control of the government. They militarize it very, very heavily. And they end up engaging the Chinese for one more fight, something that ends up being called the Sino-Japanese War. And again, China is already in a weakened state because it's in the midst of a civil war. So there's really no unified front in China to withstand this. And by December, we have 300,000 Chinese civilians who are murdered by the Japanese in something called the Rape of Nanjing. This is where the Japanese basically invade this province in China and end up taking over it, destroying a lot of the area, ending up killing, and again, in some cases, literally raping people as well. So the Japanese are starting to show themselves as being, again, more and more formidable as time goes on. In the midst of all this, okay, while all of these human rights violations are going on, while these new horrors are beginning to emerge in Europe, America is trying its best to keep out of the situation. Okay, again, we're repeating a lot of the same mistakes that we see in the First World War all over again. Okay, in 1933, before Hitler has actually even come to power, Roosevelt says that he is going to commit the U.S. to what he calls a good neighbor policy. Okay, basically what that means is we are going to remain neutral. We're not going to get involved in anything unless somebody directly attacks us. Okay, again, same type of thing that we did in World War I. But he says that it's going to be contingent on the fact that if we have anybody who is directly linked with U.S. economic, state, and financial interests, if any of those get attacked, then we are going to be forced to intervene somehow. Okay, so we're basically, again, doing the exact same thing that we did in the First World War. A North Dakota senator named Gerald Nye actually organizes something called the Nye Committee during this point in time, just as Hitler is rising to power, and tries to find basically who was responsible for getting the U.S. involved in the First World War and why we had such a massive depression happen. Okay, we're just now beginning to gradually climb out of the Great Depression. And the ultimate bottom line with what Nye comes up with is he says all the weapons makers and the bankers are the ones who are at fault for the Great Depression and for warmongering in general. In 1935, right as Hitler is coming to power, the U.S. passes what is called the Neutrality Act. Okay, and it says that the U.S. is going to prevent itself and any Americans from selling weapons or traveling on any ships owned by nations at war. Okay, so we are learning a little bit from our mistakes in the First World War. We're not going to try to play both ends from the middle here. By 1936, the United States decides it is going to ban all loans to warring nations. So again, continuing to go back on our mistakes and try to fix those as much as we can. Okay, we're not going to get involved in any war unless we are directly attacked. In 1937, we amend this a little bit and call something a cash and carry regulation. Okay, so any nation that is purchasing goods from the United States, the U.S. is not trying to necessarily profit off of the war itself, but these countries have to actually come and pick up the supplies from us. Okay, we're not going to send our own ships, in other words. In other words, we don't deliver. And the Axis alliance, which exists at this point, is again this group of governments that have all come together and have turned into what essentially becomes the antagonists of the Second World War. And it's divided among Hitler and Mussolini in Europe. Okay, these two guys decide that they are going to create a brand new order in Europe itself and divide it amongst themselves. Okay, Mussolini is essentially going to get everything from Italy, I believe, including France and perhaps Spain, if they can get Franco on their side. And then Hitler is eventually going to get all of Germany, part of France, into Poland, and even potentially all the way into the Soviet Union. Okay, that is Hitler's idea, anyway, is what he wants to get. And the Japanese, meanwhile, who enter into this agreement as well, right, decide that they are going to get that they already have a divine right to control all of East Asia. Okay, they believe that their emperor himself is actually a god. Okay, and that he is the physical manifestation of a deity, and therefore everyone else around them has no choice but to comply. Now, in March of 1938, Hitler begins his operations toward moving Germany into war. Okay, he forces something that has been called the Anschluss. This is his term for something that is basically just a union between Germany and Austria. Okay, Hitler himself was actually Austrian. Austria is a country that is up in the Swiss Alps. It is a country that's a very mountainous, very beautiful country, in fact. But Hitler, as you can see here at the bottom, this is actually a photograph of him and his and the Nazis actually marching into Austria, and it's actually very much a staged situation where you have people who are throwing garlands, putting garlands around the necks of soldiers, trying to turn this into something that appears as though everyone in Austria welcomes this idea. The problem, though, is immediately after the fact, we start to see signs beginning to appear in businesses in Germany and in Austria that say Jews not wanted. Okay, so Hitler is already beginning to inject his ideology into all of this as we go along. And he declares that this is a 99% approval of annexation among the people of Austria. Okay, and just to give you an idea here, Austria is this area down here. Okay, the southern portion. Okay, southern portion right below Germany. I mistakenly said that was part of the Rhineland. The Rhineland is the area to the west here, kind of is shaped like a human profile a little bit. But the southern part down here, this is Austria. This gets annexed into Germany. In reality, about 400,000 Austrians are actually prevented from voting, okay, in this particular little thing. And even if they were, their votes probably would have been ignored anyway. Okay, remember, in many cases, when it comes to totalitarian regimes, if an election is held, you can be sure that it is rigged. Okay? And most of the people who are actually prevented from voting are liberals and Jews, okay, people that Hitler already doesn't want any authority for. In September of 1938, Hitler gets to the point of no return. Okay, and he threatens to annex an area called the Sudetenland. And the Sudetenland is the area on the map over here that's kind of in purple, okay, right around modern day, or what is Czechoslovakia at that time. And the Sudetenland, again, is Hitler trying to test the waters. How much can I get away with? How much can I take for my own purposes until the rest of the powers of Europe intervene? And so this actually starts to make a couple of other countries nervous. Okay, France and Great Britain look at this and they say, okay, he's trying, he is actually trying something here, right? And we need to try to nip it in the bud while it's going on. So British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, who you see here on the left, the fellow with the kind of the Edwardian suit, and the French Prime Minister Edouard Daladier come together and they meet with Hitler and Mussolini in Munich in Germany to sign what is called the Munich Pact. Okay? And the Munich Pact is basically to say, okay, we are going to give you what you want, the Sudetenland, this small, relatively small area of land. We're going to give it to Germany in exchange for you to promise to pinky swear, basically, that you are not going to try to expand any further. Okay? And this is a very, very naive mistake on the part of France and Great Britain, because they expect that Hitler is actually going to be a man of his word and is actually going to do what he says. In reality, Hitler has absolutely no hesitation about breaking this. And what makes it even more humiliating, and something that you can actually find very easily on the internet, is there is actually a video, a film of Neville Chamberlain walking up in front of a crowd of people, I believe in Great Britain, and holding up the physical document of the Munich Pact and saying, gentlemen, this is peace for our time, and showing it to the people and saying this is peace. Okay. Ironically enough, within a year, the entire world is embroiled in a second world war. Okay, so this is not peace in our time. Okay, despite what Chamberlain says. In March of 1939, Hitler decides he's going to ignore the Munich Pact now that spring has come again, and he ends up invading Czechoslovakia and expanding even further past the Sudetenland. Now, Roosevelt, to his credit, can see the writing on the wall. He knows what is going on here. He knows what is coming, and he starts to try to persuade Congress to ramp up military spending because he thinks that we are going to end up in another war. And he is right. Now, 1939 is kind of when everything ends up hitting the proverbial fan. In August, Hitler does something absolutely unthinkable to the eyes of everyone else. And that even though he absolutely detests communism, hates everything about it, hates Russia, hates the USSR, hates everybody in charge, he signs what is called a non-aggression pact with Joseph Stalin. Okay? And Stalin, at this point, has risen in the ranks among the communist forces after Vladimir Lenin's death and seized power very quickly and has now become the Soviet premier. Okay, so Joseph Stalin is in control of the USSR. Okay, and you can see just how big the Soviet Union is. Okay, the entire area over here on mainland Europe, going all the way up beyond the map, as far north and as far east as you can get, all of that is the Soviet Union. September 1st, basically what this says, I should back up a bit. The non-aggression pact with Stalin basically says that we are not going to attack one another, and we are going to take Poland, this little country right here between this area that says Greater Germany, and the Soviet Union, this small little rounded country here of Poland. We're going to take Poland and we're going to divide it straight down the middle. Okay, and when we do that, we are going to the Germany is going to take the western half, and the Soviets are going to take the eastern half. Okay, we're going to divide it right down the middle. And Poland at this point is already something that is a potential neutral territory, right? It's been brand new, created immediately after the First World War, and now all of a sudden it's being divvied up and is about to be invaded from both sides. And on September 1st of 1939, Germany invades Poland, and this immediately begins World War II. This is the precipitating event. 2 days later, the British Empire and France realize that Germany has broken the Munich Pact, that they have gone back on their word, and they decide they are going to declare war on Germany. September 17th, the Soviets invade Poland from the east. Okay, now we have two armies that are seem to be working together. Okay, and at this point, it's worth noting too that the Soviets have not sided with Germany. They are not part of the Axis powers at this point. They are still technically neutral. On October 6th, the two forces meet in the center of the country, and they agree to divide Poland almost immediately and almost exclusively right down the middle. November, the Soviets decide they're going to take advantage of this situation and invade Finland up here in the north. Okay, Finland is right in between Sweden and just north of Leningrad and Astoria. And the U.S. begins allowing Great Britain and France to send their ships to America to start building up their arsenals to try to get more military supplies. Remember, this is that cash and carry thing that we have, right? We're doing carry out, but we're not doing delivery here. So the U.S. is getting involved to a certain extent, but we are not we're not going out and taking anything to anybody. We're trying to remain on the sidelines as much as we can. Now, by 1940, you can tell already just how much this map has changed. Okay, 1940 is a very frightening year because of just how much territory Hitler and Germany ends up taking in a short amount of time. On April 9th, Germany ends up occupying Denmark and seizes Norway as well. So it's immediately gone directly north and taken control of two countries in a single month. By May, Germany has invaded Belgium and Luxembourg and the Netherlands. Okay, this entire area that has been part of the First World War, right along where the trenches were dug, right all the way up into the North Sea. In this particular branch of the war here is something that Hitler calls the Blitzkrieg. Right, this is where you get, if you're a football fan, the blitz at the beginning of a play of some kind. Blitzkrieg means lightning war. Okay, it means that you basically are going so quickly and so aggressively that you end up overtaking people and basically dominating them in a short amount of time. Okay, you attack by surprise before they can do anything. May 26, Great Britain organizes an evacuation of all the British and French soldiers from Dunkirk in northern France. Okay, right around where the word Belgium appears here on the map. That's kind of, I think, around where Dunkirk is. And this has, of course, been made into a film as well. Okay, this is basically saying the Germans are coming. We're going to be outnumbered. These people are going to be slaughtered. We have to get them out quickly. And to make matters worse, in June, Mussolini now declares war on Great Britain and France. Okay, so now you have Italy coming in from the south, and you have Germany coming in from the east. And Germany marches into Paris in June of 1940. Okay, so we've, in just a short amount of time, they've taken control of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 countries now in the matter of months. Okay, again, very, very terrifying in a short amount of time. And there's a very famous picture of Adolf Hitler standing in front of the Eiffel Tower, looking up at it. And in the south, Italy ends up expanding into southern France and establishes a fascist puppet government in the city of Vichy, here in the south of France. So now France is directly divided between Italy in the south and Germany in the north. Okay, and so effectively now we have fascist Italy, Nazi Germany, and the Soviet Union all beginning to slowly divide up these different countries. Now, America's involvement in all this has been, again, just kind of as a spectator up until this point. Okay? For one thing, our forces in the Army and in the Navy, the Air Force hasn't yet been created, only number 175,000. Germany, by comparison, has 5 million soldiers. By May of 1940, Roosevelt not only calls for increasing the size of the army, but also begins to produce more and more warplanes. So we start to essentially take over these different industries in the United States, just like we did in the First World War. Okay, the government is coming in and taking control of automobile factories, turning them into plane and tank factories. We're turning them into munitions facilities. And Roosevelt plans to produce 50,000 warplanes by 1942. Meanwhile, the British Prime Minister Winston Churchill is trying his best to get America directly involved in the conflict. Okay, at this point in time, by the time we get into the middle portion of 1940, and especially into 1941, Great Britain is kind of the last holdout for constitutional democracy and monarchy to a certain extent anywhere in Europe. Okay, we have fascism taking control of all of mainland Europe at this point, and Great Britain is just a small island sitting out by itself, saying, "Help us." In June of 1940, Roosevelt establishes what he calls the National Defense Research Committee, and the U.S. begins engaging in military research. How can we create more effective weapons? How can we create more effective destructive devices? And this is where the Manhattan Project comes in. Okay? The Manhattan Project becomes the brainchild of Robert Oppenheimer, okay, a very famous scientist who is actually put at the head of the building of the atomic bomb. Okay, and the atomic bomb has not been come to fruition yet at this point. Okay, it's something that it's existed in theory, right? It's something that comes from Albert Einstein's theories of splitting the atom, of creating a gigantic explosion from such a thing. And Oppenheimer is the one who's put in charge of actually taking that science, that theory, and putting it into practice into an actual destructive device. And what happens is when the Manhattan Project occurs, we have 37 separate facilities that are built in 13 states all over the United States. And each one of these facilities is working on a separate component for the bomb. And technically, they don't even know in some instances exactly what they're working on. They're only given the specific instructions, maybe some fragments of blueprints to work on, and each one builds a separate component, and eventually it is all assembled together at the very end. Okay, so this is such a secret project that no one even really knows exactly what they're working on. Okay, it's frightening in that regard. And in many cases, the different components, they don't know what they do. They don't know what they're going to do when they're all put together. And even Oppenheimer ends up expressing a significant amount of regret once he actually sees the destructive capability of this over time. In 1940, by the time we get into September, okay, Germany has taken control of most of the northern portion of mainland Europe, and he begins to build plans for what he calls Operation Sea Lion. And this is Hitler's planned invasion of Great Britain, okay, which he plans to execute in September of 1940. Okay. And again, Great Britain is a very easy target, seemingly, at this point, right? It's a lone island sitting out in the middle of the North Atlantic, okay? And Hitler is already taking control of 5 different countries in the course of maybe 2 months. So Winston Churchill, the British Prime Minister, begins very stringent preparations for Germany's invasion, okay? He thinks that they are going to try to invade on the ground, that we're going to have ground troops in place just in case. And he makes a very, very famous speech in which he says, "We will fight them in the sea, and the land, in the air. We are never going to surrender." Okay? And he says, "We're going to fight all the way till the death if that's what it takes." And between July and August of 1940, the German Air Force, called the Luftwaffe, sends planes to begin round-the-clock bombing raids in southeast England. Okay, and the image that you see here in the background is the aftermath of one of these bombings. I believe this may actually be in London itself, where people actually have to continue on with their lives in the midst of all this. Okay, this is a fellow who's actually a milkman delivering bottles of milk, climbing over the rubble to try to get to different people's houses. Okay, and so these round-the-clock bombing raids become so severe that eventually, over time, the British people actually have to start evacuating the cities and going into the countryside. Many families actually end up sending their children away to try to prevent them from being hurt or killed by the bombing raids. In fact, if you ever watch the modern version of the Chronicles of Narnia, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, the entire beginning sequence of the film takes place during the midst of this attack. Okay, and the children actually are seeing the bombings occur. That's how they end up getting sent away into the countryside and finding Narnia and all that anyway. In response to the Luftwaffe's attack, Great Britain sends out the Royal Air Force, the RAF. Okay, and the Royal Air Force are a group of trained pilots. These guys are professionals, and so they are sent out to destroy the German Air Force in the process, and they end up destroying 1,700 German planes in the process of all this. Such a dramatic defense, so much so that the German Air Force is not able to complete its mission. Okay, and part of that has to do with the fact that the RAF actually has radar on its side. Okay, radar is a brand new invention that's only been in existence since the end of the First World War. Okay, it's been gradually developed over time. Now, once we get into September of 1940, going all the way into October, this is when we have nightly bombings of British cities. Okay, so not only are they being attacked during the day by the Luftwaffe, we see dogfights occurring in the skies over Great Britain. Now we're having these attacks by the Germans at night. Okay, and the Blitz, again, Blitz is just lightning, is what the word means. Continual nightly bombings to try to instill terror in the British people. Okay, and that's really what you see in the aftermath here. The Blitz specifically attacks London in addition to other cities in southern Great Britain. And we end up with 1 million homes destroyed and approximately 40,000 civilians who were killed in these attacks. There's tons and tons of devastation that ends up occurring. And again, people have to continue on with their lives, and that's where you get the keep calm and carry on image that is becomes the British motto during the time. Eventually, Hitler realizes that he is throwing so much money, so many resources at this particular operation that he eventually decides to abandon it because he believes that Great Britain is a small power in comparison to some of the other ones that he could potentially take control of. So he abandons Operation Sea Lion in October because of the heavy opposition from the Royal Air Force. Okay, and he ends up actually turning it in a completely different direction instead. Okay, so the Battle of Britain is what we call this period from the summer into the autumn of 1940. Now in America, we enter into another election period. Okay, in 1940. FDR calls for all aid short of war. So he is willing to do whatever it takes to send supplies and stuff to the Allied forces, the forces that we've already shown ourselves to be associated with in the First World War, but we still are not willing to send soldiers yet. In September, we get the Destroyers for Bases agreement that we enter into with Great Britain. Okay, and this basically says we are going to send 50 U.S. destroyers, right, these armored steel-clad warships, to the Royal Navy in exchange for U.S. to get bases in the Caribbean. Okay, so we're basically trying to get a little bit of a benefit out of this deal ourselves. Okay, and by this point, Germany and the Royal Navy have already engaged in submarine warfare in the North Atlantic. Okay, so again, we're getting another repeat of this type of conflict from the First World War and the Second World War. Okay, and for a while, the Royal Navy is really the only one standing again against Germany at this point. On September 16th, we get the Selective Training and Service Act, so we end up coming out with another military draft. This is for men from the ages of 21 to 35. And later on, the age is reduced to 18. Okay, and we see that happen specifically during the Vietnam War. And we have two different camps that come out in the midst of all this. Again, right in the midst of an election period, right in the midst of the beginning of a war. We have groups that are isolationists who basically say, we don't want any part of this war. We're siding with Franklin Roosevelt. We don't want any kind of conflict. We want to stay out of it as much as we can. And then we have interventionists, people who, to varying degrees, say we need to send more supplies, perhaps even soldiers, to end up getting involved in this war at some point. Okay, so some people say it's wisdom to stay out of it. Other people are saying you're cowards for staying out of it. We need to get involved. And unfortunately, a national hero ends up coming out on the side of the enemy here. Okay, Charles Lindbergh, who became very famous in the 1920s for having the first solo nonstop transatlantic flight in the spirit of St. Louis, actually ends up leading the isolationist effort here. And you can see him here actually making the Nazi salute. Okay, this is actually, yes, this is him. It's not just a situation where he's raising his hand. This is him actually giving the Nazi Heil Hitler salute. And he specifically puts faith in Hitler's assault on Jews. Okay, Lindbergh actually comes out in favor of Nazi Germany here. And of course, as you can imagine, the election of 1940 is directly driven by a debate over whether the U.S. needs to get involved or not. Okay. The Republicans end up nominating a former Roosevelt supporter from Indiana called Wendell Willkie, and he calls FDR a warmonger, says that we need to, stay isolated, stay out of this. Democrats got us involved in the First World War, and we need to stay out of it again. Okay. Roosevelt, though, because he has already gotten the U.S. past the Great Depression, because many of his policies have worked, wins an unprecedented third term in office. This is the first time this has ever happened in U.S. history, and it has not happened since. And so by 1941 now, the U.S. is going to eventually get involved again. Okay, we are agreeing to send more supplies in something called the Lend-Lease Act. Okay, it says the president has the right to lend or lease military equipment to defend our interests overseas. And FDR makes a vow to provide aid to Great Britain and to nationalist China. Okay, he is coming out in opposition to the communists at this point. And between 1941 and 1945, it's estimated that through the Lend-Lease Act, the United States sends about $50 billion worth of supplies to its allies. Okay, so this is far and beyond the war debt that was accrued by World War I. Now, by the time 1941 comes around, okay, the entire political atmosphere of the war in mainland Europe begins to change rather dramatically. Germany now has decided to join Italy in its conquest of Libya and northern Africa, and Great Britain has had to withdraw all of its forces from northern Africa into Egypt, even though it has tried to suppress German expansion in North Africa. The U.S. has not gotten involved just yet. In April, German forces now end up overwhelming most of Central Europe, so down into Yugoslavia and into Greece and the Mediterranean. Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria all end up joining in with the Axis powers. Okay, so most of Central Europe is now directly allied with the Axis powers. Then, in June, Hitler does something, again, unthinkable. Okay, and this is part of what ends up causing a lot of academics to look at Hitler's strategy and say that he becomes more and more unhinged over time because he's not consistent with his strategy. He realizes that he is not going to be able to conquer Great Britain, and instead he decides he's going to turn his entire German war machine around and attack the Soviet Union, okay, with whom he has already made a non-aggression pact with. Okay, and remember, this is something where Germany has already got a history of making these deals and then going back on them very quickly. So June 22nd, Hitler launches what he calls Operation Barbarossa. Barbarossa means Redbeard. Okay, so Operation Redbeard is what this is called. And now his entire mission becomes to destroy communism, first of all, to enslave the Soviet population, which is no small task because the Soviets have several millions of people under their auspices, and specifically to take over Russia's natural resources. Okay, and Russia is highly industrialized. It has several hundreds of factories. It has the entire Siberian forest. It has coal mines. It has all kinds of stuff that could be used to build more and more ships, to build more and more tanks, planes, bombs, guns, you name it. Okay, so Russia is a treasure trove for the German war machine. And between July and October, the Soviets end up retreating, first of all, and they end up losing about 50% of their forces, roughly 3 million soldiers, to capture in the process, because they don't expect this to happen. Okay, Stalin looks at this and he says, okay, we need to actually turn things around and now turn our aggression on Germany instead. Siege of Leningrad, which is up here in the north. Leningrad is now called St. Petersburg. Ends up getting to the point where about 800,000 people end up starving to death. Okay, and that is the key feature of any siege, any time in history, is that if you have a city or something like that is under siege, it actually closes its walls in, and the attacking forces end up cutting off all supply lines. So the people living in the city either succumb to illness or starvation or some combination thereof. Okay, and that's exactly what happens here. And by December, the Germans actually end up reaching Moscow. Okay, so this sounds like the Soviets are actually now on the defensive, that they might not actually get out of this very easily. Okay, this is a really bad situation, right? 2/3 of this little branch that you see on the map over here have already been conquered. Okay, and Stalingrad we'll see actually happen in the following winter. And Russia begins to actually ramp up its rhetoric here when it comes to its own soldiers, and it starts conscripting civilians to end up fighting on behalf of the Russian army, and tells them, you either fight or you will be killed. Okay, and about 8,000 conscripted soldiers are actually killed for cowardice, is what the excuse is given. A very fine depiction of this is the film Enemy at the Gates. It's a film that was produced, I think, sometime in the early 2000s. It has Jude Law in it. And it surrounds the siege of Stalingrad, the Battle of Stalingrad. In it, you actually see Russian officers standing at the back of the Soviet lines, sending their soldiers into battle against the Germans, and the Russian officers actually have pistols aimed at their own soldiers, saying, Comrade Stalin has said, there is no surrender here. There is no retreat. You either fight and potentially be killed, or you will turn around and you will for certain be shot for cowardice. So you actually have now Russian soldiers that are caught in the crossfire, right? Their own officers threatening to kill them, and the Germans threatening to kill them as well. Okay, so this is a very, very horrible situation. And from the winter of 1941 to 1942, Germany becomes eventually halted because of the bitter climate of Russia itself. The Germans are not well supplied for this. They're not supplied to fight in winter. And because the Soviets end up becoming more and more fierce over time, in some cases because of desperation, because they are either starving or they're being threatened with death by their own officers. Now, at the same time that all this is going on, okay, Roosevelt decides he's going to include the Soviet Union in the Lend-Lease agreement, because now the Soviets are under attack from Germany as well. In August of 1941, Roosevelt and the other allies end up signing what is called the Atlantic Charter, and that's what you see here happening in the background. You have Franklin Roosevelt on the left here, and then you have Winston Churchill on the right. And what this is basically an agreement that the two come up with for the Allied powers and what is going to happen after Nazi Germany is destroyed. And this is a very tall order at the time, because it seems like Germany has the upper hand, that they might actually win this conflict. Number one, they agree that they are going to allow universal self-determination to occur. And if you recall, self-determination is something that was promised at the end of the First World War. Okay, this is where imperialist powers say that if there is a new country that wants to be created, okay, if there is an existing group of people who want to create a country, then we are going to give them the right to do so. Okay, again, very tall promise that can't always be, or is not always agreed upon in the moment. We're going to agree to economic cooperation, so we're going to have Great Britain, the United States, all agreeing to work together. We are going to try to allow freedom of the seas. Okay, so international waters is something that we're going to try to honor. And we are now going to create a new form of the League of Nations that we call the United Nations. And the United Nations does exist today. This is something that is a successful form, a second form of what happens with the League of Nations, and is actually something that is implemented. September 4th, the U.S. destroyer Greer is attacked by a German U-boat off the coast of Iceland. Okay, and so now FDR authorizes the use of naval force in the Atlantic. Okay, so now we are actually sending more and more warships from the U.S. Navy to assist the Royal Navy. Okay, so we are actually getting involved to a certain extent in the war, not on the ground yet, right? In the sea for sure, though. The U.S. warship Kearney is sunk by a U-boat in October, kills 11 sailors. Okay, so we are actually still getting involved in the conflict directly now. And the U.S. destroyer Reuben James is torpedoed and sunken on October 31st, killing 115 sailors. So this is actually Germany doing exactly, again, what it did in the First World War. It's engaging in unrestricted submarine warfare. It's not allowing sailors to actually abandon ship. It's not taking prisoners. It's sinking without warning. And so now the U.S. allows merchant vessels to be armed and to enter combat zones. Now, to back up a little bit, in 1940, Japan has already begun to advance and expand its territory so much that it has gotten very, very full of itself. Okay, and it believes itself to be Asia's quote-unquote leading race. Okay, it's kind of adopted the same ethnocentric principles of Nazi Germany here, and it agrees that Japan believes it's at the kind of the top of the totem pole, with China and Laos, Cambodia, France, Indochina, and all that kind of stuff being under it somehow. And the Vichy government in southern France, remember, which is controlled by Italy as a fascist state, it agrees to allow Japanese airfield construction to occur in Indochina. And Indochina is controlled by France at this point. Indochina is modern-day Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. Okay, so this is kind of a direct lead-in to what we eventually see with the Vietnam War. By July, the United States decides it's going to restrict any military supplies given to Japan at all, because it realizes Japan is beginning to commit these atrocities just along the same lines as Germany and Italy. In September, Japan signs what is called the Tripartite Pact with Germany and with Italy, saying basically we are going to bind ourselves to the Axis powers. Okay, so now we have these three main powers, Japan, Germany, and Italy, all on one side. And we're going to declare war on any nation that attacks our allies here. Okay, so if one country attacks Germany, Italy, or Japan, the other two countries in the Axis powers will attack that country. Now the U.S. puts a trade embargo on Japan and completely grinds it to a halt. Okay, so we end up cutting off all money that is sent to Japan. We end up cutting off their fuel supply. And in July of 1941, Japan announces that it's going to completely take over French Indochina and gain all the resources that have been denied it by the United States. Roosevelt says he's going to restrict all exports to Japan, completely shuts down the Panama Canal, prevents Japanese shipping from going through, and at the same time, too, he looks at the Philippines, which are still a U.S. territory at this point, and says we are going to merge the Filipino army with the U.S. Army. Okay, we're going to ramp up our defenses because it is so near where Japan is. In October, Hideki Tojo becomes the Japanese prime minister, and Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto becomes the head of the Japanese Navy. And he declares that in order for Japan, that is, to have a quick victory against the United States, we have a duty to perform a quick strike against the United States in order to win. Okay, we have to do something very quickly, a surprise attack of some kind. November 5th, Japan tells Roosevelt to end the embargo or face conflict. It sends a warning out directly. And the Secretary of State, a guy named Cordell Hull, demands that Japan remove all troops from China first. He says, we will end the oil embargo if you agree to do this. Instead, though, Japan is not willing to comply and begins sending warships into the Pacific. And of course, by the time we get to December of 1941, we enter into the beginning of the U.S. direct involvement in the Second World War. Okay? December 7th, the Japanese warplanes called Zeros are sent in a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Okay? And this is, as Roosevelt deems it, a day that will live in infamy. 8 American battleships are either sunk or disabled, okay? And 11 other commercial vessels and supply vessels are also disabled. Okay? 180 U.S. warplanes are destroyed. Several hangars, several airfields are demolished in the process. And about 2,400 American servicemen and civilians are killed, with about 1,200 wounded. Okay? And this is the largest attack on U.S. soil that continues on for several decades, all the way up until September 11th, 2001. Okay, so this is something that has never happened before in American history, and is something that is extremely radical, right? Something that the United States can actually rally around now. We have been physically attacked. Now, the fatal mistake that the Japanese make here, and something that causes the Japanese prime minister to say that he fears that the Japanese have awoken a sleeping giant, very infamously says that, is the fact that the bombers failed to destroy any of the maintenance facilities. Okay, so all the planes that are damaged, that can be repaired, are repaired. They also failed to destroy the storage tanks for all oil. Okay, so these ships that have we can't actually refuel more ships, in other words. And potentially the most important thing about this is all of the U.S. aircraft carriers were actually out to sea that morning. Okay, they were actually running maneuvers out in the Pacific, and so none of them were actually destroyed. And it's the aircraft carriers that become so instrumental over time in getting the U.S. Airplanes into the air, right? All the fighter jets during the war. December 8th, Roosevelt turns around and declares war on Japan. And December 11th, 3 days later, Germany and Italy follow through with the Tripartite Pact and declare war on the United States.